DeFi by Design, where we talk all things blockchain and cryptocurrency while striving to educate, empower, and enrich.
What's going on, guys? Welcome back to DeFi by Design podcast, episode 99, one away from 100. What a journey it's been, and we're excited today to dive into a topic that we've been going on about for at least 6 months now, perhaps even getting close to a year, which is the development of layer 2, specifically on StarkNet. What's going on there? What's going on with Cairo, the programming language, the upgrades, a lot of the protocols and projects there. And then also just some general thoughts about DAOs and kind of how you can get involved to help DAOs, how Peter has been kind of consulting and working in the crypto space for some time now, kind of some of his general and specific thoughts as well about the space. So looking forward to diving into this one. And of course, today I'm joined with Peter, who has been spearheading a couple projects in the space since he joined. So would love to hear a bit about kind of your journey so far, let our audience know kind of what you've been working on, and we'll jump right into it. So good to have you on, Peter, and good morning.
Yeah, great to be here. Good afternoon. I'm clearly one episode too early, but hopefully the 99 is pretty cool as well. So my brief intro is I work on Yagi.fi, which is a yield aggregator on StarkNet, and then I also do consulting for Web3 teams. Peeling that back, I started working on crypto in 2018. I came from a mix of an engineering and management consulting background. So initially worked at startups like Google and Twitter in California, engineering and data science roles, then got involved with McKinsey as a management consultant, was basically building kind of spreadsheets and PowerPoints for 2.5 years there, working in different industries as a strategy consultant. And it was really fun to kind of step back from engineering for a bit and really try and pick up all the soft skills that I definitely lacked. Also had a degree in mathematics, which made it even worse, right? So I really needed that, I think, kind of business school style experience. And then got involved with product management when McKinsey acquired Quantum Black to do AI type work, started building products, built an open source library there that's now a machine learning framework, part of the Linux Foundation called Kedro, and just really enjoyed the process of working on a developer tool as a product manager, thinking about kind of how to design the API and so on, and also just the impact of building an open source project, building a community and so on. And so it was a fairly natural transition to then, getting exposed to crypto, where I saw a lot of developers being able to have a lot of impact. And that was kind of one of the things that actually led me down the route of going into management consulting and product management, where I saw that I was somehow capped as a developer. And then in crypto, I saw people who didn't really have necessarily those skills, but still could like lead companies, do impactful projects. And that's what really pulled me in. And so 2018, I started doing consulting for various Web3 projects, really focusing on this developer tools idea, specifically focusing more on security. So I started off doing kind of formal verification, tooling, dived into debuggers, played around with using reinforcement learning to find bugs in Solidity, really a bunch of things kind of to do with the EVM. And then as the space matured and we kind of got into the bull cycle of 2020, started working more with smart contracts, did a bunch of governance proposals, did smaller projects for teams working on kind of small insurance funds or vaults and things like that in DeFi. And then really late 2021 came across StarkNet. And it was a kind of an inflection moment where I felt that I've learned, a lot about smart contract development from really working on these projects, but also felt like I wanted to learn about L2s. I was really excited about what was happening with zero knowledge. I saw StarkNet had a completely different programming language. That seemed really exciting. And so it was like the perfect moment to basically start a project. And so I started working on Yagi as a yield aggregator for StarkNet.
Yeah, I kind of had a similar understanding of layer 2s around the same time, kind of when Arbitrum really launched, and I ended up bridging a lot of what I was doing over to Arbitrum and just testing it out. And, I'd been messing around on Avalanche and Phantom and things, so I was already sold on the idea of not doing all my transactions on mainnet. But then Arbitrum, with the kind of understanding of the security and the speed and kind of the inheritance of the Ethereum kind of network, if you will. It kind of was obvious that those were going to be superior to some of these other EVM chains that I was messing around in. And then yes, similarly, boom, StarkNet hit. And there happened to be this kind of strong community around StarkNet at that time, kind of around the same time as you mentioned, mid 2021, early 2022. And it's really kept its shape all the way up until now, and building pretty much just a variety of different DeFi protocols, in this new language with the kind of ZK Snark tech. Briefly for our audience to start off, I would love to kind of hear why you feel that the ZK Snark and the ZK tech of StarkNet is superior to whether it be optimistic rollups or other forms of blockchain execution and settlement layers, in the least technical way that somebody could understand, if possible.
Yeah, I think trying to go very non-technical, I would say at a high level, what's really exciting about ZK technology is that you I think going back to like why are transactions expensive on Ethereum? They're expensive because effectively we're paying people to replay the transactions many times over, right? And so that's kind of why Ethereum is more expensive than AWS, right? Something runs once on AWS, but if we play a transaction on Ethereum, we need a bunch of validators to just keep replaying that transaction. And so the idea behind ZK is instead of replaying the whole transaction, can we produce a proof that the transaction happened? And can we find a much more efficient algorithm to kind of run that proof and verify the transaction happened without having to rerun it? So we still get, a large number of validators who are validating these transactions, but the validation process is substantially different. And it happens by kind of validating these proofs. And so you can then get into what are the different types of there's ZK Snarks and there's ZK Starks, which are kind of two different systems. And Starks is really what StarkNet uses in particular. And that were actually invented by the team behind Starkware. And the kind of high level comparison between Starks and Snarks, you can actually look at them in many different categories, and it's fairly interesting how it will play out in terms of which ones will matter. And I would say it is somewhat use case specific, because you can look at things like proof size, you can look at things like transaction costs, bandwidths, all these different things. But the theoretical potential of Starks is greater, but the challenge is really of building a ergonomic ability to write Stark proofs. And so the kind of intuitive comparison is like when you think about ZK EVM, ZK EVMs are typically written in Snarks because the mapping between like what we're doing at the EVM level and Snarks is very direct. Versus if you're working with Starks, it is much harder to map it into kind of the programming language paradigm we're familiar with of mutable memory and so on that Solidity provides access to. And therefore, if you want to kind of get the extra scale potential of Starks, unfortunately, you have to kind of build your own virtual machine. And so that's the hard work that the StarkNet team has done, and really in building Cairo and building the whole stack behind Cairo to build a Stark native programming language to kind of help unlock that scale. And it seems like that would be a lot of unnecessary work. Like, why are we going through that trouble of creating a whole new programming language when we have Solidity? And like, shouldn't Solidity be kind of the JavaScript of the smart contract? Should we just use Solidity for everything? And I actually think the answer is no. And the reason, even though we may feel that, for example, today, Optimism, Arbitrum, all these platforms are fairly cheap, right? You can deploy smart contracts on them, and they're just so much cheaper to use than mainnet Ethereum. I think what we've historically found is that people exhaust kind of the scale that they're given. And so if we look back at what happened on mainnet Ethereum, we started off with people experimenting with all sorts of applications, right? At some point we had lending protocols that were storing loan books on chain, right? When that was affordable. And just eventually, as we start to kind of saturate block space, we naturally find that we saturate whatever efficiency is given to us. And so I think, and now if you're a good Solidity developer, right? Like, well, as we've seen with OpenSea, for example, that contract was handcrafted with assembly. So all of a sudden we're working in Solidity, but we're really not, because we're actually jumping in. We're looking at Huff. If you're doing anything serious with MEV, you're probably coding in Huff. If you're writing really kind of serious high volume Solidity contracts, you're probably jumping into Yule. And so kind of the ease of use and the familiarity of Solidity is something we just end up foregoing anyways. And so at that point, it's fairly compelling to say, hey, no, we can jump on the Cairo bandwagon and here use a language that's actually more high level, even easier to use in Solidity, has additional safety properties in the language, which we can dive into, and actually be more efficient. So it just feels like an impossible trade-off, but it's one we're able to make today.
Yeah, and I think that kind of thought process and messaging is going to be very important for really just onboarding people into StarkNet and into this kind of realm of thinking, right? I mean, ultimately, people don't really care that much about the ins and outs of, let's say, like the technological languages in the program, but what they care about is the speed and the cost, and also by inherent nature the security as well. And so, I think bringing this messaging for across the board for StarkNet teams into mediums like such, like the show, or just kind of in easy to understand threads and posts and articles and things, is going to be very key for kind of onboarding more people into understanding first why this is happening. Why do we need to have cover? Why should I use StarkNet? And I think you make quite a few good points. And from the developer side, most of the developers that I've spoken to with regards to Cairo also kind of are in the same boat, right? They think it's just a superior programming language as a whole, and currently obviously there's StarkNet is still in development as far as its speed and transactions and its capabilities, but my kind of thought process is we're about a year or so out from zk EVM, Polygon zk EVM, StarkNet, zk Sync, and the other kind of bigger ones, really taking stride. And then I think that really gets us to a point where there's two things that I'm quite interested in hearing your opinion on. First is, what does the world of rollups look like? Like, are we going to have like dozens and dozens and dozens of different rollups? And, are we going to have different optimistic ones, ZK ones, and potentially we can even dive into like how that they might interoperate with each other. But then on the more kind of fun side, and I think that I would like to understand it in explanation too, as far as decentralization of these rollups. We saw our Arbitrum launch their token. Optimism did too. StarkNet has already hinted that they will, and that they've already gone ahead and distributed some to different teams and things. So each of these rollups is going to have to decentralize their sequencer, which we can kind of unpack what that means, and decentralize and solve the kind of like the nothing at stake problem. So are all these rollups just going to have tokens as well if we exist in this world with a bunch of rollups? So yeah, we'd love for you to unpack kind of what's the future of these rollups? How is there going to be just tons of them? How will they kind of interoperate? And then how will they decentralize? Will there be a token for all of them? And kind of what's your thoughts on that front as well?
Yeah, great question, and one that I wouldn't say I have the perfect answer to. I don't think anybody does, but let's try and speculate. I think there's a couple of directions this thing is developing in, and there's a couple of frames of reference to use. One frame of reference is the sort of scalability lens of rollups, which is you make a rollup, you're effectively compressing n transactions into one, costs go down, bandwidth goes up, and so on. And so it's purely a scalability play, and one where you're basically trading off, you're potentially introducing some latency into the picture, right? So if you're minting an NFT on a rollup, it takes a bit longer for that NFT to eventually kind of appear at the lower level of mainnet. And the reason I'm kind of explaining it this way is I think because it partially explains why we have this idea of fractal scaling, where we have L1, we have L2, but then people are already building and thinking about building layer 3s on top. And the idea is that we can kind of keep going further and further on this kind of pure scalability spectrum of let's just compress more transactions into less state, while trading away potentially some security properties or some latency properties in terms of having that guarantee of being able to eventually withdraw that money on layer one. So that's, I think, one angle in which rollups are pushing, which is basically like whatever network they're under, just scale that network. But then there's kind of this computational diversity angle, which is, I think, also super interesting. And I think we're just not at that stage yet where that's really playing out, because most of the rollups that we're seeing are really scalability focused rollups. They're really focused on just general computation and scaling Ethereum as the narrative. But we've started these discussions, certainly in the StarkNet community, those discussions start up when talking about layer 3 rollups, because the question is, okay, if StarkNet is the base network, are there some games or are there some other applications that require their own app-specific rollups, right? And then the question is, why do they require those? And then one idea is like computational niches, the idea that there's some virtual machine layout that is just better for a certain application, right? For example, for games, you can optimize for specific requirements. Maybe they need a lot of storage, and then you can really over-engineer the rollup to focus on that aspect of how to store specific state. We'll have obviously kind of D by DX and other types of order-based systems rollups that are targeted at that. That's kind of how StarkX was actually born, which was kind of the precursor to StarkNet. Was actually a very specific type of rollup that was developed to help develop kind of AMMs and the different types of different types of DEXs, basically. So that's a second point. And then there's kind of the third point, which is the interplay of those rollups. Because again, if we go into a rollup, and now we're in a world where the rollups are there because of computational niches, not just as general platforms, then all of a sudden we want some composability. Like, we're losing some composability, right? Because if you have to go to one rollup to play your game, and then to another rollup to maybe access DeFi, and then you want to invest those gaming assets to generate some yield, now you have a problem, right? So we have this like third question of, how do we start composing rollups? How do we start interoperating? And so obviously we have things like shared sequencers, and there's all this kind of optimization on L1 around how to make rollup transactions cheaper. So I think that there's like a lot of research going on in that direction. I think we have the perfect layout, but that's certainly going to be another trade-off of, you can get very specific, but then where do you lose the composability to the rest of the ecosystem? And I think that honestly, like, the future is just going to be the interplay of these three factors and the trade-offs between them. And so it's going to be very domain specific. I think in gaming, we're probably going to see much more silos than we may see in DeFi, where we really value the composability a bit more. But yeah, it's ultimately very domain specific, and hopefully we'll see a couple more domains, right? Maybe around the NFT space, there's going to be specific needs emerging there. Maybe we'll start to finally see. I think enterprise blockchains is another angle, which we've kind of forgotten about that part, right? It was kind of around the time I started in blockchain in 2018. I think enterprise blockchains were still part of the narrative. This idea that 20 banks could agree to deploy a private blockchain between themselves. I think now that narrative is kind of falling by the wayside, right? We found there were several challenges with that. One was actually there's no connection back to public blockchains. We haven't yet developed bridges that are really secure at connecting two L1s, right? So there's a challenge there. But actually, now that you think, well, what if that private blockchain could be a rollup, let's say on top of an L2 or top of an L1? All of a sudden, it starts to make more sense, because you can restrict that rollup to have a very limited number of validators or whatever rules you want around that rollup, and you can still access the underlying assets, right? So now those banks could settle with Ethereum or with stable coins and not have to kind of build it all from scratch, right? Not have to kind of recreate the whole DeFi stack from scratch. And so I think private blockchains are potentially, have a way of kind of coming back through the rollup narrative. So I think those are just some of the factors that'll play out. As far as your second question around the tokens, it seems like most rollups are, will need a token to decentralize. I think we could definitely see non-decentralized rollups that are going to be, potentially for games. Like, not every rollup, maybe for a game, needs to be decentralized. And potentially we're going to see maybe more creative structures, especially when one team develops multiple rollups. Perhaps they don't each need a unique token. Perhaps there's some synergy there. And then again, in terms of that kind of vertical scalability piece, if a network decides, okay, we need another rollup for people to make a certain latency transaction cost trade-off, like maybe the same native token could just be used at that level as well. So I think a lot of considerations there, but I think for now, and to be honest, like I think one of the appealing things with app specific networks, right? It's sort of if you make a really successful smart contract, you do a big token launch, and you have a massive DAO. Now, if you want to 10x that, what do you do? Well, so you look at DeFi Llama and you say, well, the only tokens that are bigger than mine are the ones from like L1s and L2s. And that's a lot of work to build a whole ecosystem around that. But what's kind of in between building my own L1 and building a smart contract? Well, it's building my app chain, right? So that's why I think a lot of teams also from purely from financial perspective, probably look at app chains as an opportunity to really continue growing as a company. And so I think we'll definitely see a lot of tokens associated with rollups effectively in the short term, at least.
Yeah, we already seen app specific chains like you're saying for order book DEX is DYDX, and DGate is another one. They created their own zkRollup specifically for their own order book DEX. They're actually sponsor and good longtime partner and friend of ours at the Rollup. And I think gaming is also clearly a huge one too, because like you said, the financial aspects of the game perhaps less important than the speed and the user experience versus and the security versus somewhere like DeFi when you want to have kind of those money Legos working together. And in addition to that, make sure that everything is fully secure. And then on the 3 points of scaling, I mean, those are really they're intuitive when you say them, but before you kind of think about them, it's hard to kind of fathom what that looks like because it's really deep diving into the abstract. And so it's a tough speculative call to make, but inevitably we're going to see more and more basically layers of scaling happen, whether it be layer twos of different layer ones, and then kind of, as you're saying, rolling up even further from layer twos to layer threes. So nonetheless, very exciting. And I kind of want to touch a little bit deeper on the token aspect and just kind of ask a broad question. Like, aside from grants and community incentivization and just, making everybody happy and hype and making everybody feel good and giving everybody free money, like, why does StarkNet need a token?
Oh yeah, great question. I think generally, one of the, if we look back at kind of the past 6 months around StarkNet, and we kind of summarize the narrative, I think a lot of people ran out of technical challenges to point to, because initially, I think StarkX was one of the, in terms of just raw TPS and a bunch of other metrics, it was just on the leaderboard in terms of rollups very early on. So the question just became, can it turn into a general smart contract platform? And when the StarkNet team proved that with Cairo, they showed that there's a language that can actually make it really easy to build these types of applications. So we started to run out of different critiques of the community, and I think the one critique that remained is really still around scalability. I think the TPS is not matching what we had on StarkX, but there's a lot of improvements coming, I think, actually very, very soon, that will probably within the next week or so, that I think are actually going to change that. And so I think we've caught up on the TPS side, but it's taken probably 12 months to really make a dent there. And then the second concern was always around decentralization, which is like, well, you guys are building all these really cool things, but the prover is not open source and the sequencer is not open source and it's all private. And it's like, what's going to happen with that? And so I think that's been like a lot of the focus also over the past 6 to 12 months. A bunch of those things are open source now. There's open source projects that have spun, the modular sequencer, for example, to create independent versions of each of these components. But ultimately, there needs to be a governance process now to decide, right, what happens with all of that. So I think that's where the token comes into play. Into kind of the final piece to decentralize is really, who's going to be working on those things? What are going to be the canonical versions, the canonical sequencers? What's going to be the canonical prover? And the final step is basically, the token. And so that's why, StarkNet now has a foundation. That's why a lot of the decisions around, all the great things you mentioned, like grants, incentives, and so on, are now really moving into different committees as part of the StarkNet Foundation. is because we're trying to decentralize the governance of the network.
Yep, that's kind of the idea that I had as well. Just wanted to confirm there because that seems to be the underlying issue when rollups launch without a token is there's this kind of centralization of factors that are very important, as well as, again, there's this kind of thing where the validators of the rollup are ultimately not being compensated, and also there's that kind of there's no token, so there's no value at stake in the chain in the sense that if the team that was building behind the rollup somehow lost it all or went bankrupt or had a terrible fallout, there wouldn't be any repercussions for just kind of shutting down because, well, there's nothing at stake there other than kind of what I guess you call them hard assets have been bridged or are kind of on the chain. So it gives the team and the community something to rally behind in terms of actual value creation. And then, of course, the other kind of community marketing BD type of things are much more enabled, and you can onboard a lot more talent through grants and things like this. So you're pretty excited about what's going on with the upcoming TPS upgrades, which of course I am as well. I've been using Bravos and kind of all different types of applications on mainnet and testnet for some time now, and I've noticed that the speed is still it's nothing close to Arbitrum or kind of Optimism or even some of these other layer ones. But with this Cairo 1.0 going live, some of these upgrades happening, you're pretty bullish on that. So we would love for you to unpack kind of what's going on with Cairo 1.0, what that's all about, why it's important to you and for the teams that are building on StarkNet, and what kind of expected upgrades that we can see come soon.
Yeah, absolutely. So Cairo 1 is kind of the second big release of Cairo. We call the old one Cairo 0. And Cairo 0 actually historically evolved as a very low level kind of assembly language that was just a way to abstract the creation of these zk proofs. And so it started super low level. Then when people wanted to build contracts on top of it, the team decided to create some higher order syntax that resembled Python on top of it, but it was never designed to be higher order language. So there were a lot of conceptual challenges kind of working with Cairo 0. The ecosystem was still able to recreate a lot of contracts that we see on mainnet and also try some new ideas using Cairo 0, but ultimately it was clear that that language was suboptimal. And so Cairo 1 is kind of the from scratch rewrite of that. And I think what's exciting about Cairo 1 is a bunch of things. So really first, it's designed from the ground up to kind of have a layer-based approach where there's Sierra in between, and Sierra is kind of the intermediate representation. And what that allows the team to do is to really stabilize this sort of intermediate language, but then allow the higher level language to evolve very quickly. And so that without necessitating basically network level changes, right? So especially as we move to decentralization, that's just going to be very, very useful as a property. And so kind of that's sort of from compiler architecture perspective, it's really a decoupling of StarkNet as a network, and then Cairo is the language that enables. The second piece is kind of just getting up to par in terms of ergonomics, where my experience with Cairo 0 was that it was more difficult to develop in than Solidity. I think Cairo 1 definitely gets up to par. And then the more exciting is Cairo 1 actually incorporates many, many ideas that Solidity should be incorporating, and basically feels much more like a regular programming language. And so that's where it starts to get exciting. Cairo 1 was modeled after Rust. So a lot of the syntax is similar to the language that has become a favorite language for backend developers in the crypto space recently, right? With the advent of Foundry and other libraries on top of Rust. And so it's a very, very common language, but then really tailored for smart contract development. And then there's a bunch of extra things that even I'm discovering recently, digging into the language, such as turns out it has linear types, for example. That is actually something that very, very few smart contract languages have. The first one to really incorporate linear types and get popularity was Move, and obviously with the kind of whole resource model. So that's also very exciting, which is that Cairo 1 is actually now taking a step beyond Rust and incorporating more advanced type systems that are really going to help in terms of making contracts more secure. So that's kind of the pure ergonomics piece. And then there's also the I would say the developer experience piece, which is hard to explain, but kind of one of the reasons that people were so excited about Foundry in the first place is that, Solidity was really slow to work with, and so Foundry really allowed the development cycle to get a lot faster, purely because of just technical speed of how quickly you can run a test or how quickly you can compile the code and so on. And with Cairo, we're seeing an even order of magnitude improvement over, I think, what we saw with Foundry. And so that's the thing that gets me really excited, where working with Cairo really feels like I'm just working with, C++ or Python or just a regular programming language all of a sudden, not this really slow kind of smart contract environment. And so that's, from purely a developer perspective, I think Cairo 1 is really exciting. And of course, all the things that's enabling on the back end for the network is kind of the big unlock that allows kind of the TPS improvements and so on to continue cascading. And there's a lot of, there's a bunch of pieces in the stack that are being experimented with now that I think are going to unlock further scalability. So for example, the Lambda team is building, they're building a way to compile Cairo code to MLIR. And so MLIR is a system built to help more effectively compile TensorFlow at Google. And it's just sort of very, very advanced compiler framework, where as long as you can compile things to MLIR, you can compile things to work really fast on hardware. And so now we move to a world where we don't need to kind of emulate the way Cairo works, but we can literally run Cairo in the same speed that we could run a regular computer program that's doing kind of non-smart contract related things. And I think that's going to be a complete game changer for developers, the more they discover it.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, that's a whole leg up against kind of what else is being built out there. And I think a lot of the reason for my general bullishness on StarkNet comes from this aspect. And I'm kind of more on the non-tech side, but I've done quite a bit of research, and speaking with you and other people who build with Cairo all kind of have the same thought process, as far as a little bit tough to understand. This is Cairo 0 I'm speaking of. But once you get it, the possibilities become much more innovative and limitless than other languages. Now with Cairo 1.0, kind of more familiar with devs who understand Rust, or just overall an easier transition. That kind of conviction is strengthened even further. And I'm curious, is account abstraction enabled because of Cairo, or is that like a direct correlation? And briefly, if you could explain, account abstraction for audience and why it's important before kind of diving into that one.
Yeah. So I think one of the fun things about the StarkNet ecosystem is that it's trying to work towards overdetermined success. And what I mean by that is that there's not like one thing. It's not like, StarkNet has Starks, and then it's just the minimum implementation of everything else. Like they weirdly try to innovate across many different levels, and so I think actually account abstraction is somewhat independent from Cairo, in the sense that you could see account abstraction implemented in Solidity. And in fact, there's obviously active proposals for account abstraction to go live on many other networks. And it's being implemented on many other networks, with sort of practical challenges around adoption and so on. I think the difference with StarkNet is they got it done really early, and they basically established that as this is the canonical way that accounts are going to work. So what is account abstraction? Really, it's a decoupling of the account and the signing mechanism, I would say, in simplest form. So in traditional non-account abstraction model, or the end user account model, you have an account and it has like a built-in signing approach, where you need a private key and there's like a specific signing scheme that you need to use to validate transactions. And then account abstraction kind of decouples those things. It says you can have an account. That account can just be a smart contract, and that smart contract, you get to define how transactions are signed as the kind of developer of that smart contract. And so now if you still just want to use private keys, you can build that with account abstraction. That's totally fine. But then you can also say, hey, let's allow this user to log in through Safari, and let's use secure enclave, and then let's access that key, and then use that key to validate their transactions, right? So all of a sudden you can you can make accounts of things that traditionally couldn't have been accounts. Whereas if you had to do that with Ethereum kind of before account abstraction, you would always have had to generate that private key, right? So you want to create a throwaway wallet, you have to generate a private key. If you wanted to let users log in from another type of service, then the service on the back end would have had to create that private key, right? It couldn't have directly tied into whatever the authentication mechanism it wants. So it's really a decoupling of that allows many, many different ways of signing and validating transactions that are much more ergonomic, right? And sometimes those things are just, there's going to be easier account recovery because you can involve your friends. Sometimes, if you're playing a game and you need $5 to play the game and just buy the NFTs you need, like maybe you don't need a hardware wallet for that, right? Maybe you just want a really lightweight mechanism, and worst case, you lose that account for some reason, or you're willing to kind of take on some centralization risk, right? That this game provider, maybe they're managing the account on your behalf. Maybe that's totally fine, because the only thing that matters is if you do get a bigger NFT, that you can then migrate that to an account that's more secure, right? So it just opens up the space of trade-offs. So kind of to summarize, I don't think it's necessarily, it's coming from Cairo 1. I think it's an independent feature that networks could adopt. We're starting just really early in using account abstraction, and so I think we're seeing some teams like Cartridge, for example, just really, Cartridge are building a platform for people to access different games. You can think of it as the Steam for StarkNet. And so their approach with account abstraction is they've been able to incorporate, your secure enclave on your Safari or on your iPhone to authenticate into that platform, right? So those are the kinds of things that the StarkNet community has been experimenting with for a while now.
Yeah, yeah, it's good to know that there's a difference there. A lot of I would say 99% of the account abstraction conversations that I've had have been with StarkNet based teams or industry leaders. So it's nice to know that could be separated. And I think really it's the future of wallets. I think the MetaMask experience kind of sucks. And even like Rabby and other wallets are, they're better, but they're still just not the same as far as different functions. And one of the biggest ones that really struck me was did a podcast with Rohit from Jedi Swap months ago, and he touched on setting automation parameters for your wallet. So where you can have a setting in your wallet where let's say every week you set a parameter where your wallet sends 1,000 USDC to your I don't know, to a different wallet, or it can automate a transaction for you, without really you having to do much, but kind of set it up. And the ability to have your wallet be a smart contract. I mean, you can do so many things with calls and with functions and with different types of interactions and transactions that just aren't really able to happen with a kind of a normal wallet. So I kind of view account abstraction wallets as like a smartphone, and the kind of the setup that we currently have is like a wallet that's in your pocket with credit cards and cash. So very exciting to hear those takes and to hear some of the teams that are building about using that technology and improving the experience for users, which ultimately I think is what it all comes down to. I think the users might not really care about the difference between Starks and Starks. I do. I think it's cool. I think it's very interesting. I don't think they'll care very much about the exciting ideas of why Cairo, why Cairo 1.0 is great, right? They don't really care. But like when they can do these easy transactions on mobile wallets like Bravos or Plena or Argent, and it feels so smooth and it's cheap and easy, and there's tons of innovative functions, then I think they'll care, especially when they're profiting off of it. So I think it just kind of enables that next level of adoption, and that kind of brings us full circle into what you're building, which I think could be very, very big. I think Yagi could be one of the bigger projects on StarkNet by TVL as a whole. I've seen Beefy on Ethereum as well as on all the other chains always have the best rates and be very, very reliable. And Beefy is another yield aggregator for those who may have not heard of it. So yeah, I'm curious kind of what teams you're thinking about building with, what are some of the yield strategies that you're thinking about implementing, whether it be DEX, LP positions, derivative DEX, kind of debt pool type positions, new token emissions, StarkNet token emissions. Kind of what are your thoughts around some of the yield opportunities that are going to be available in StarkNet soon, or are currently available now?
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. To kind of follow on from that, I think account abstraction is one of the kind of most exciting user-facing things, and that's ultimately kind of all that matters. Really, is what do the users get at the end of the thing, and I think account abstraction is kind of part of a general transition that we're taking, going through from users actually having to actively send transactions into the hot topic, which is intense, which is basically more generalized versions to define transactions. Perhaps instead of saying I want to trade, sell this asset on Uniswap, I just want to get rid of this asset at whatever I can get the best price, really moving kind of at a more high level abstraction. And then I think the next version of that is really objectives and kind of what I call passive finance, where you don't actually want to be taking any actions, right? You ideally want to just deposit your money and have it grow over time and then withdraw it whenever you need it, right? And so that's kind of what Yagi's there for. For people who are familiar with yield aggregators already, it's the kind of core differences with another yield platform, right? That like Yearn, for example, or other platforms like Beefy, is that one, we're based on StarkNet, so we're kind of fully focused on native StarkNet yields. Big believers in StarkNet, so that's a core part, and we'll talk about what those yield opportunities are. The second piece is actually confusing the unique properties of StarkNet to do things that were not possible on mainnet, and so one of those things is really moving more of the logic on chain. So the goal with Yagi is to really make it as trustless as possible, and so the goal is to use as little oracles as possible, to use as little off-chain management as possible, and really have it truly run as an autonomous contract. And I'm a big fan of kind of index funds in the traditional finance world, because they are very like they do what it says on the tin, right? An index fund describes exactly how it's going to allocate capital, what assets it's going to use, and kind of what you're betting on. And then weirdly turns out that actually for most people, investing in index funds tends to be much more profitable than trying to find active managers. And I think the same is going to be true in crypto, where most people are just want to look at kind of what the strategy is and just deploying that strategy. So I think that's what Yagi can become with the properties of StarkNet. By making computation really cheap, by making storage really cheap, we're going to be able to just put a lot of algorithms that currently happen off chain for many yield aggregators, such as, hey, we have 10 kind of funds, and we have some predictions on how they're going to return. Let's optimize the allocation between those 10 funds. I think we can put that on chain with Yagi. And then to answer your question about specific yield opportunities, the teams partnered with before on testnet were XBank originally to build a lending wrapper vault, Jedi Swap to build a two-sided liquidity vault. So this is a way to basically participate in AMM liquidity provision without having both tokens. So if it's a DAI ETH pool, we built two vaults, one where you can just deposit DAI, another one you can deposit ETH, and then both depositors will get kind of merged together and we'll make a collective liquidity share for them, but they both get the same effectively return profile in the end. And then also on the more exotic side, did a little collaboration with Realms to build a kind of staking vault for their ecosystem. And I think those directions kind of very much describe what we're looking to do on mainnet in terms of really working with DeFi teams to build aggregations on top of finding the best lending yields across the different options, finding ways to provide liquidity in AMMs, and then also potentially partnering with gaming teams. I think that's again which StarkNet's going to make that much more possible. On mainnet, what we saw is that there was not a lot of opportunity for people to really automate their participation in games, and it's something I think people have appetite for. We saw a prototype with Abe Gotchi. It was like a Abe Gotchi petting farm where it was like a daycare where you could actually deposit your Abe Gotchi and then it automated the petting action. I think with StarkNet, hopefully we'll see much more sophisticated gaming economies. And I think we'll actually have vaults where you are going to have your game token resource, and you're going to say, you know what, like I don't have time to play this game all the time, but I do want to have some automation happening while I'm not playing the game. And so it'll deposit into vaults for that reason. And so I think it's just really about And then kind of the third piece, which you alluded to as well, is obviously rewards and tokens. And so I think to the extent that StarkNet teams are going to be, launching tokens or creating incentives that are based on tokens, obviously it would be natural to build those strategies that automate the harvesting or of the rewards and so on. So that's definitely something, in terms of a yield aggregator, my big belief is that yield aggregators have to be very responsive to the market. It's kind of a very different contract to build compared to an AMM. Where an AMM, you kind of build your contract and then you're done, and you kind of think about the next version. Versus with a yield aggregator, you constantly have to be putting out vaults that really capture the best opportunities available. So that's kind of so part of this is like, these are the things I'm looking to build, but part of it is actually really seeing how the ecosystem is going to develop, and we're going to respond to that.
Amazing, man. I look forward to seeing it come to fruition, especially with the upgrades in TPS and Cairo 1.0, as well as just new projects and developments on StarkNet. So yeah, man, it was an absolute pleasure having you on. And I look forward to seeing what you build again. And yeah, thanks for your time.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. Great questions, and yeah, I'm very excited for the Rollup ecosystem, and I think StarkNet's just one of many teams in it, and I'm also rooting for a lot of the other teams to succeed as well. Don't get me wrong, I think this is the journey of scaling Ethereum is a very exciting one, and one that's not it's not simply about, again, doing more of the same, but it's about all these different niches.
Yep, 100%. Tons of rollups, tons of ZK tech, tons of scaling. I look forward to it as well. So keep doing your part. We'll keep doing ours, and hope to see it come back in a year or two's time, and things will look a lot different.
Awesome.
Cheers, buddy.